Thank you for coming this evening. If everyone would please turn off their cell phones and any other kind of distracting device. It's a very full room, and I appreciate all the great turnout for this evening's lecture. Welcome to the lecture by Professor Ralph Hancock, which is entitled Christianity and the Political Life. I'm Jenna Story. I'm the Managing Director of Furman's Tocqueville program, which is sponsoring today's lecture. Before I start to introduce our speaker, I'd like to take a moment to say something about the Tocqueville program. The Tocqueville program exists to encourage serious and open engagement with the moral and philosophic questions at the heart of political life. What we try to do is take a step back from the headlines and examine the enduring problems that underlie our pressing concerns. So in order to prepare for this kind of conversation, the Tocqueville program sponsors a number of courses and other activities that structure an education in the history of political thought. Every year, we offer a course and lecture series that focuses on a question of contemporary import. This year, in the spring, our theme will be love, friendship, and politics. Given that our personal loves have become partisan issues and that friendship across party lines is increasingly rare, what can we learn about love and friendship and politics from the great minds of the past who have considered the complexities into which our passions lead us? We'll study Plato, Aristotle, Montaigne, C.S. Lewis, Jane Austen, Frederick Douglass. More information about this course, which is aligned with the spring lecture series, is available on the table outside the door. The Tocqueville program also hosts the Society of Tocqueville Fellows, which is a select group of students chosen by competitive application who are interested in focusing their studies on political philosophy and the way in which it can help one gain unique insight into the problems of our day. Finally, we work closely with the Political Thought Club, an independent student group that meets on Friday afternoons to read and talk about great works of literature and philosophy. Right now, we're reading Homer's Odyssey. We are reading at a philosophic pace, so you can feel welcome to pick up the book and join us anytime. More information is available on the table just outside the door. The Tocqueville program is supported by a broad coalition of philanthropic organizations and generous individual donors, including our founding donors, Ginny and Sandy McNeil, who are here with us tonight, Beth and Ravenel Curry, the AWC Family Foundation, the Strata Educational Network, and the family of Jane Gage Hipp. Our sponsors support the Tocqueville program in the belief that genuine liberal education encourages students to become more thoughtful citizens and more dignified human beings, and we are immensely grateful for their support. It's with great pleasure that we welcome Dr. Ralph Hancock to Furman today. Dr. Hancock has proposed to offer us some thoughts on the question of the relation of Christianity to political life, today with special reference to the work of the contemporary French philosopher Pierre Manent. Indeed, there may be no one better positioned to help us understand Manent's work than Dr. Hancock, who has translated numerous volumes of Manent's writings, provided illuminating philosophic commentary on his thought, and has known the man personally for several decades. Dr. Hancock first became interested in the questions that we will be considering this evening on his mission trip to Paris, undertaken just after graduating with a BA from Brigham Young University. There, Dr. Hancock told me a charming story. He would wake early, before a day filled with missionary duties, to study the fine points of French grammar. He came to love France, he said, because it first showed him that the life of the mind is a fine thing. At the same time that Dr. Hancock was discovering the beauty of philosophy, he was becoming more interested in the political problems of the day, and particularly the place and task of America in the world. These philosophic and political concerns took him to graduate school at Harvard University, where he completed his dissertation on John Calvin. Since then, Dr. Hancock has held teaching appointments at Hillsdale College, the University of Idaho, and Brigham Young University, as well as several visiting professorships in France. He is the author of several edited volumes, as well as books such as The Responsibility of Reason, Theory and Practice in a Liberal Democratic Age, which concerns the thought of Tocqueville, Strauss, and Heidegger, and Calvin, a book called Calvin and the Foundations of Modern Politics. Dr. Hancock also blogs for Square 2 and The Postmodern Conservative. We are very fortunate to have him here with us today, all the way from Utah. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ralph Hancock.
Thank you, Dr. Story. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to everyone who made this occasion possible. Thanks to the Tocqueville program and its sponsors. I was delighted to meet Jenny and Sandy, and I don't remember your last name, but I'll remember it later. Delighted to meet you as we began. Am I getting a little amplification here? It's working okay? Good, thank you. A Tocqueville program. I warm to the name. I'm the faculty advisor of a Tocqueville society, a Tocqueville club on the campus of BYU, and you couldn't do better by a name. You can't beat Tocqueville except with more Tocqueville, or possibly except with a little dose of Pierre Manent, the contemporary philosopher whose work I will be discussing. It's spelled like Manent, Pierre Manent. Pierre Manent's Practical Natural Law. A lot is buried in that title. But before I get carried away, besides the stories, whom I'd like to thank, or Jenna at least, I don't know what Ben did exactly. No, but I was happy to meet him. He married Jenna, so okay. There is that. Oh no, I much enjoyed discussing with him and the others today, and my old friend Ty Tessitore, who may have had a hand somewhere in the invitation for me to speak here. So it's really good to reconnect with Ty and to find you all at this wonderful spot with wonderful educational opportunities that you have here. Christianity and Political Life, Pierre Manent's Practical Natural Law. Let me tell you the shape of my presentation so you'll be able to track our progress. I know I like that. When I go to the dentist, not to compare my talk to being subject to a dentist, but when I go to a dentist, you can't talk while he's working on you. So I say, just tell me, like, if there are 4 steps to what you're doing, just tell me, because I hate just like sitting there and not knowing. So I hope I will be less painful to you than a dentist, but I'm going to tell you the steps that I will be tracing. First of all, I have an introduction in which I talk about a triangle of spiritual and intellectual life in which Manent situates himself. And then I'm going to add some biographical information about Manent. So an introduction in 2 parts, the triangle and biography. Then a discussion of the problem of the modern world as Manent sees it. A discussion in 2 parts of the solution. Well, solution is kind of too much. The way he addresses the problem. We call it a solution as a convenient handle. And finally, some Christian complications of this solution that Manent proposes. Introduction then, the triangle. Pierre Manent has described the career of his thought as taking place within a triangle formed by 3 eminent concerns, 3 rival answers to the question, how should I live? These 3 are politics, religion, and philosophy. Oh, look, I'm counting in French. The French go like this first. I go 1, 2, 3. But now, under Manent's influence, I'm counting in French. Politics, religion, philosophy. Pierre Manent recognizes that a strong case can be made that a serious and thoughtful human being cannot avoid choosing one of these concerns as ultimately authoritative, and just one. For the pious person, for one who would be a saint, a striving to order one's life by fear or love of God and by worshipful obedience must overshadow all other concerns. For the political man par excellence, the consummate citizen or statesman, for a Washington or a Churchill, all speeches and deeds must be weighed as they affect the common good of the city or nation. And so religious and philosophical perspectives must bow to this highest political perspective, to the highest political imperatives. The genuine philosopher, for his part, is one who strives first and always to live true to the imperative of understanding for its own sake. This philosopher is, say, Socrates, or Leo Strauss, for those of you who know who I'm talking about, or perhaps Friedrich Nietzsche, or maybe Even more truly, some nameless searcher who lives and dies by and for the commitment to see clearly the way things are and to stand in the light of this truth without illusion and without blinking. Now, Pierre Manent recognizes the claims of each of these understandings of an authentic human existence, and yet he has found himself unable to choose any corner of this triangle to the exclusion of the others. He continues to hold his pursuit of truth within the surface of this triangle. Now, by the end of this presentation, I hope you will have begun to see more clearly how Manent understands human existence within this triangle, politics, religion, and philosophy, how he means to give each corner its due without renouncing the space opened up by the tensions among the three. In particular, I want to explain how, for Manent, and let me say that I agree, the political corner holds a certain primacy. Let us therefore stand the triangle on its political point, which nicely suggests what turns out to be a fundamental insight of Manent. So, religion, philosophy, politics. Stand the triangle on its political point. Manent's insight is that the other two corners, though apparently more eminent, more lofty, appear within a perspective inescapably shaped by the real natural condition of humanity, which Manent thinks, following Aristotle, is a political condition. Politics is not the highest concern, nor is it an autonomous domain. To be itself, politics must be open to goods beyond its competence, the very goods that religion and philosophy seek to discern and to represent to us. The realm of the political does not supply a broad and complete foundation to the fullness or perfection of human existence, whether this perfection is conceived religiously or philosophically. If the political dimension, the political angle of this triangle, provides any kind of foundation, this is only in a more subtle way, a kind of guidance that is robust in its resilience, but quite limited in its provision of explicit general principles. This corner is a source of insight available to the natural understanding, an insight that Manent sharpens by engagement with the excessive claims, on the one hand, of overconfident theology, and on the other, of overambitious philosophy. And where the claims of philosophy are concerned, let me say at the outset that Manent is critical, first and foremost, of the blinding pretensions of modern rationalism. But on closer inspection, he is also critical of the untenable claims made on behalf of reason of Leo Strauss, and indeed of the classical philosophers whom Strauss strove to emulate. The biographical section. I first learned of the work of Pierre Manent the old-fashioned way, by exploring a shelf of books among the endless stacks, as they are called, of Harvard's Widener Library. There, within a few feet, I think of some work by Leo Strauss, perhaps Natural Right and History. A French title caught my eye, Naissance de la politique moderne, that is, births, plural, births of modern politics. Perusing the pages, what struck me was that the influence of Leo Strauss, whom I had recently discovered myself, was brilliantly evident in the work of a young Frenchman whose name I had never before read or heard. Born in Toulouse in the south of France in 1949, Pierre Manent was seized by political questions from his earliest years. His father was a committed communist, and the young Pierre himself was fond of Soviet youth novels celebrating heroes of communism. He took an interest in the missile race between the Americans and the Soviets, cheering for the achievements of the Russian representatives of universal humanity. He benefited from a rigorous classical education in a public lycée, or secondary school, including Greek and Latin, where communists and conservative Catholics together shared in the religion of learning, including especially assiduous attention to the glories and demands of the French language and its literature. In his later teen years, came a spiritual and intellectual turn that distanced Pierre in these respects from his father, with whom Pierre has otherwise remained close even to the present day. A Catholic high school teacher steeped in the high medieval philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, led young Pierre to the conviction that Christianity possessed an ultimate truth regarding humanity, and Pierre eventually converted to the Roman Catholic faith. This faith he still practices, and this conviction he has maintained throughout his intellectual career, even though he has been consistently discreet in his references to religious beliefs, has always argued on the basis of reasoned observation and reflection, and indeed has for the most part kept a polite distance from identifiably Catholic political or philosophical movements and tendencies, averring, as he does in Seen Politically, that he has found it to be hard for committed Christian intellectuals to avoid claiming to know more than can really be known. A brilliant student, Pierre Manent was accepted to the École Normale Supérieure, an institution that has produced most of France's brilliant intellectuals. However, ideological passions associated with the famous events of May 1968 had overwhelmed the life of the mind in Paris, and Pierre's disappointment with the dominant intellectual currents led him to the teaching of Raymond Aron, A-R-O-N, the rare great social and political thinker among French intellectuals who held fast to reasoned inquiry and moderate, sober political judgment on a public intellectual scene dominated by extremism and irresponsible posturing. Pierre became Raymond Aron's assistant and prospered under his mentoring for many years. It was Aron's example, as much as his teaching, that assured Manent of the possibility of real and rewarding knowledge of political things. Politics is something that can be known. Manent's account in Seen Politically of his turn towards Leo Strauss, which was never a turn away from Raymond Aron, is quite instructive and even touching. And here I begin to refer you to the quotations that I have supplied. Do many of you have these pages? I see some of you do. Share with a neighbor if your neighbor doesn't have one. I've just printed some quotations to relieve you of the burden of too difficult listening. Quotation number 1, I impatiently, this is Manent speaking of his turn from Aron to Strauss, I impatiently desired some transcendent measure, you mean some standard of judgment. And this impatient desire for a measure, a standard, Aron could not satisfy because he did not feel it himself. Aron understood immediately that I wanted to follow a path on which he could not guide me. He suggested that I would find in Strauss, the Platonist, the follower of Plato, something that would bring me closer to my goal of a standard. I've always been grateful for this. Aron led me to Strauss, knowing that to go towards Strauss was to distance myself from him. He did it very spontaneously and naturally. I find that to be a touching story. Manent explains his debt to Leo Strauss as follows, quotation number 2. In the face of this great orchestra of modern philosophy, we hear Strauss's discordant voice, at first almost inaudible, a very sober and reticent voice. But this music of Strauss's is such that once it has gotten into your system, you are profoundly taken by it. All the forms of prestige under which we live are subverted to the point that we find ourselves asking this radical question. Does this huge deployment of modern political philosophy, with the huge institutional machinery that we have built in large part according to plans laid down by this philosophy, do these not finally have the effect of separating us from nature, and in the first instance, from our own nature? We find ourselves obliged to ask the question, what if the modern project is carrying us even further, ever further from ourselves? Besides Raymond Aron and Leo Strauss, I would note among Pierre Manent's influences, especially first Aristotle, standing behind, one might say, both Catholicism, and Leo Strauss's return to classical political thought. And standing behind Raymond Aron, one might say, is the great figure of Alexis de Tocqueville, the namesake of the program, whose unique, high-minded liberalism Aron, Manent, and others in their circle did much to recover for French intellectual life. Further discussion of Manent's sources would include Charles Péguy, a brilliant and poignant French poet, essayist, and patriot who died in the Great War, Aurel Kolnay, a Hungarian-born 20th century philosopher and political theorist, and an acute critic of totalitarianism and of the excesses of democracy. I leave you to my friend Dan Mahoney's nice characterization of Manent and these influences. That's quotation number 3. And quotation number 4 is not a quotation, it's a list of some of Manent's most notable works, which I will not read aloud. Instead, I'll move to the topic of the problem that motivates Manent, the problem against which his whole intellectual career is defined. Pierre Manent's overriding political and philosophical concern may be stated thus. The modern liberal strategy of separations, some of you have studied texts in which Manent presents his view of this strategy of separations. The modern liberal strategy of separations and the philosophical rationalism on which this strategy is based tends powerfully to separate human beings from their nature as moral agents and political beings. So something about the modern strategy of separations, which I'll come to, tends to separate us, to alienate us from our nature as moral agents and political beings. Liberal democracy orders and explains itself in terms of an interrelated series of separations: the separation of powers, the separation of church and state, of public and private, of state and society, of fact and value, of objective science and subjective freedom. All these separations, while often, of course, beneficial up to a point in their practical consequences, all of them, Manent argues, ultimately imply and tend towards a disastrous compulsion to separate opinion from power. What we believe about the meaning of life, for example, and the institutions of political power. People's most basic beliefs from the character of their institutions and their public life. Thus, the common world is evacuated of recognizable human purpose, and human beings are alienated from the meaning of their own humanity. Under the spell of these modern separations, human beings are freed from the moral and religious principles of action. However, as Manent shows with new force and clarity in his recent, so far unpublished, Gilles Sonde lectures on natural law and human rights, delivered in Paris this last spring. As he shows there, emancipation from our moral political natures as human beings means that we are separated from the very conditions of freedom itself, from the very structure of human agency, as the enactment of some authoritative law or rule in view of some good. The strategy of separations tends in the long run to separate us from the moral structure of freedom itself. Under the reign of this disastrous separation of humanity from its moral political nature, the state emerges as a blind mechanism of sheer power, standing over against society, society being understood as the realm of sheer lawless and therefore meaningless freedom. Because the very character of purposive free choice has been denied and excluded by this strategy, freedom collapses into necessity, the legitimation of raw desire, and most recently, the expression of identity asserted as a brute fact of nature. Thus, the characteristic contemporary moral political gesture of coming out, the public exhibiting of one's radical individuality, as an expression of a naturally determined not a freely chosen, but a determined identity, is the last gasp of liberal freedom of the strategy of separations. The modern science of separations has thus liberated us from traditional authorities, from God, from nature, but only by progressively evacuating, emptying out the public space in which we live and breathe of all human meaning. Thus, we, denizens of modern liberal democracies, lose our grip on our own being as moral and political agents, and we increasingly find it impossible to undertake actions or to know ourselves. Examples of our loss of grip on ourselves as moral agents are so rife that they are hard to see, but it strikes me, and this is my example, not Manent's, that we have a nice case in the recent or ongoing controversy surrounding the behavior of National Football League players during the traditional playing of the national anthem. The shared term national, NFL, national anthem, might alert us to the question, what do the NFL and the Star-Spangled Banner have in common? What makes us a nation? What view of the human good have we put in common by embracing or accepting the benefits and thus the duties of common citizenship? That's the kind of question that Pierre Manent would ask. Now, what this tiresome controversy points up in its emptiness, I would say, is that we do not even know how to ask the question. Before the question, what's the point? What's the point of the anthem? What's the point of the gesture or the protest? Before such questions can be asked, we are reminded of the rights that are being exercised on the one hand and on the other. And I'm in favor of those rights. Pierre Manent is in favor of those rights. But the obsession with rights blinds us to the substantive question of what this is all about and what the point is. They have a right to protest. We have a right to protest their protest. And I suppose someone has a right to protest our protesting their protest, and take it as far as you like. We all have rights, and it seems they all mean nothing beyond themselves. Pierre Manent had already discerned this sterilizing tendency of modern democracy in his early book, Tocqueville and the Nature of Democracy, where he describes the democratic passion for a bottomless equality, abetted by the inhuman pride of modern secular rationalism. This conjunction, democratic passion, prideful or arrogant rationalism, tend to the endless leveling of every assertion of greatness or every expression of a particular individual or collective pride, thus endlessly trampling anything of distinctly human form, Manent writes. Now, in his most recent lectures on natural law, Manent casts this progressive abolition of humanity as the triumph of a theoretical over a practical perspective on humanity. That is, in attempting to extend the range of human power indefinitely to overcome the inherent limitations of moral agency and its all too common failure to live up to its own self-understanding, the moral failure that is inherent in human nature, by attempting to overcome this, the rationalist conception of humanity has made us invisible to ourselves as moral and political beings. Modern freedom, limitless and indeterminate, is based on the suppression of or the oblivion of what the tradition knew as free will, that is, moral agency or reflective choice. Modern rationalism tries to make us freer by denying the moral dimension of freedom itself. The most large-scale political expression of this oblivion of humanity in the name of freedom without higher good or law is the empty universal humanitarianism, the cosmopolitanism devoid of substance that has informed the vague but alluring project of Europe, a project that is supposed to grow ever more unified by abandoning anything distinctively European. There's a nice quotation from Manent, number 5 there, but I think I've stated the essential point, and so I will leave that quotation to your consideration and move on to the part of my talk entitled The Solution, which is an exaggeration. I mean, the way Manent proposes to address the problem of the liberal rationalist strategy of separations and the way it separates us from the practical meaning of our own existence. So to address the evacuation of human meaning under the reign of the modern strategy of separations would require a recovery of the possibility of free, reflective choice, of moral agency. And the fullest, most paradigmatic expression of moral agency is political action, understood in a classical sense, a putting in common, a common commitment to a common good under the authority of some implicit understanding of the good or the rule of action, within the framework of some shared moral sense. Part one now of Manent's solution, Aristotle on practical goods. In these recent lectures on natural law, Manent argues that such a recovery of our concrete moral and political existence would require that theory defer to practice, the theoretical viewpoint to a practical viewpoint, to a respect for the immanent structure, the inherent implicit structure of action, such as Aristotle discerned it. The ends of human action, Aristotle shows, come to light as means, the ends come to light as means to common goods. And notably, these means are especially the cardinal virtues, courage, temperance, justice, and prudence, or practical wisdom. So the highest, and moreover, the highest expression of the moral and deliberative means, the moral structures that arise in seeking what is good, the highest expression of these as the noble end or summit of action is the statesman's composition, his bringing together of the common good from the various parties' propositions of incommensurable goods. The best good emerges from the statesman's work to compose the rival goods of the city. Now, an indispensable window onto Manent's Aristotelian factor, his following of Aristotle, is his first great statement, The City of Man, chapter 5, where Manent produces Aristotle as an alternative to Immanuel Kant and to Friedrich Nietzsche. The explicit debate that constitutes the city, Manent explains, concerns the meaning of justice and thus the character of the regime. The plurality of claims of justice arising from different characteristic parts of the city typically come down to the contest between the few and the many, oligarchs and democrats. These two parties advance respectively the claims of property and of free birth. But beneath these, the political philosopher discerns the city's raison d'etre, its inherent purpose, that is, the aim, quote, to make citizens good and just, and by that very fact happy. Now, Aristotle I've been quoting from the Politics, or describing his book, The Politics, but in another book, The Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle will develop a rich teaching on virtue and its inherent happiness, a teaching that culminates in the divine activity of pure contemplation, knowledge for its own sake. But even there, even in the case of the summit of divine contemplation, even there, I have argued, the philosophical highest end remains implicated in the practical political means, in morality and politics. But in any case, Pierre Manent here notably leaves aside this argument of Aristotle's that leads from politics to a culmination in a higher philosophical good. He leaves this aside and instead traces the problem of higher authoritative ends to its political culmination right here in the book, The Politics. The problem is that a true city, the city of the virtuous, the ideal city, must take into account the real city with its challenging plurality of legitimate claims, claims based on noble birth, on freedom, on wealth, on virtue, on military valor, etc. Now, the commensuration, the common measuring, the composing together of these claims is, Manent writes, theoretically insoluble. There's no math to do this. Quantitative, like statistical regressions, are not going to help us figure this one out. Still, every political regime, as a particular regime, imposes a practical solution to this theoretically insoluble problem. That's what statesmanship at the highest level does. Now, what is distinctive in Manent's Aristotelian view is that the judgment or decision that resolves this problem of plural claims on the higher good is seen, the solution, the judgment or decision is seen neither as derivable from some theoretical principle, as an exponent of universal human rights or an advocate of natural law might hold, nor as an arbitrary act of the will, as Nietzsche would conclude. Instead, indetermination is not an abyss, but the complexity that holds out the promise of the good. This is an opportunity for the highest human virtue and goodness to emerge. The genius of Manent's entire project may be glimpsed, I suggest, in this promise of the good, a promise that lies within, not beyond, political deliberation. And I believe it is not accidental that Manent does not here limit his claim to the promise of the practical or the political good. Rather, his suggestion is that the human good itself is not exactly limited to, but inescapably bound up with the mind's and the soul's engagement with the plurality of substantive claims that emerge in our natural political existence. It's a long sentence. Do you get that? What the good is not something above politics in this high sense of deliberating about how to compose the plural claims of the good. There's not a theoretical good that one can grasp to solve this problem. But what follows is not the abyss. What follows is not relativism or, let's say, decisionism or the will to power in the case of Nietzsche. What solves is an opportunity for what makes humanity great. An opportunity creatively to compose and to facilitate the emergence of a good of another order. Quotation number 6. In advancing his claim, each claimant to the meaning of justice, the Democrats, the oligarchs, the soldiers, the artists, the capitalists, you could add, each claimant proposes a certain equivalence between his own good and the goods of others, a certain relative measure of the goods that constitute the city. Yeah, art is important, but somebody's got to pay the bills, so what about entrepreneurs? That kind of argument. A certain equivalence between his own good and the goods of others, a certain relative measure of the goods that constitute the city, which is generally not unfavorable to one's own position. If the artist making this argument is going to say there ought to be a national endowment for the humanities, et cetera, et cetera. Faced with having to acknowledge that this equivalence is less certain than it seemed to him at first, imagine the artist or the entrepreneur saying, I hadn't thought of that. That other guy or gal has a point too. In this way, he or she moderates his claim and lowers the relative measure of his own good. The result is the practical commensuration of theoretically the adjustment, the working out of the relationship between goods that seem to have no common measure. This practical commensuration of political claims is, of course, a compromise, but it is not merely a compromise, not simply a bowing to necessity. Quotation number 7. Thanks to this moderation, the sum of the goods in which my party, my family, or I myself share will be increased. It's not a zero-sum game. And I'm not speaking only in quantitative economic terms. Everybody benefits from this practical composition of the goods. The statesman's work of compromise is not merely a necessity, but a particularly noble and delicate task. The statesman must give each good its due, in conformity with the intrinsic dignity of this good as he judges it. in making this judgment, he applies a principle, this language is very important, a principle of personal and private appreciation, for example, of a philosophical or religious sort. He might be a libertarian, he might be a Christian or a Muslim, he might be a follower of Ayn Rand. So naturally this affects the way he judges the composition of the plural claims. But he must do it in such a way as to assure the integration of all the goods in the unity of the same city. Here he acts in his specifically political role of a statesman whose task is to preserve and promote the common good. Now, let me say that both the nobility and the delicacy of the statesman's task are on fine display in this brilliant discussion of Manent. But the reader may still judge this political task to be lower than the ultimate concerns of philosophy and religion. That would make sense. I think, though, however surprising it may be, that Pierre Manent's presentation puts this ranking, politics and philosophy here, philosophy and religion here, this political work of managing pluralism down here. Manent's point is precisely to put this ranking in question. Note that he qualifies philosophical and religious principles as matters of personal and private appreciation. Compare this qualification to his praise of the end of statesmanship, that is, the common good. Quotation 8. The common good is not, then, a good that can be isolated from the different goods and elements that constitute the city, nor is it a sort of common denominator, unlike the good of self-preservation, which for the modern philosophers will be the foundation of human rights. It is both the supreme good and the good which binds the different goods together that can have no direct rapport with one another because they are incommensurable, not measurable by the same standard. It is the good without which this common good, composed by the statesman, is the good without which the other goods could not coexist, that is, could not be present at all in the human world. So Manent does not say only that the common good, the good that results from the statesman's mediation, is the supreme political good. Instead, he presents the common good as the supreme good, and I think he goes far towards justifying this praise. Just as the intrinsic good of virtue arises from a deliberation in which virtue appears explicitly or directly only as a means, so the dignity of the highest good crowns the noble and delicate task of effectively commensurating the practical goods of the city. The highest human good lies in reflective or rational responsibility for the practical viability of the plurality of human goods. The highest human good emerges from this task, intellectual, political task of managing the variety of human goods. Now, the residual mystery of Manent's luminous account lies in the fact that you may have noticed that the noble or honorable or moral appears on two different levels of Manent's scheme. This is a bit of a complex discussion, and I'm going to skip to the conclusion without justifying it, and that is that Manent's complexity, which imitates Aristotle's, is deliberate. That is to say, he doesn't want to create a system in which lower political and moral goods, the indirect goods arising from moral and political action, he does not want to interpret these as merely instrumental to a higher philosophical or religious good. Indeed, in a way, his whole point is to reverse the priority and to teach us something of the dangers of imposing a theoretical viewpoint of some higher end on the goods that emerge from our moral and political practice. So, whereas Aristotle and Plato in different ways, Plato most clearly, subordinate practical political goods to some higher intellectual good, Manent says, no, I'm not going to follow you there. I'm going to respect the practical structure of the moral good, the indirect emergence of the good from a moral and political good. Similarly, and most strikingly, Manent makes the same move with respect to Christianity, to Christian theology, and to the tradition of natural law itself. Let's resist not only the philosophical, but the Christian theological temptation to subordinate political and moral goods to some systematic idea of human perfection or any systematic table of natural law, let us say. Thus my title, Practical Natural Law, Pierre Manent's Practical Natural Law, as opposed to the theoretical and theological natural laws or natural rights that have dominated the Western political and philosophical tradition. But whereas Plato and Aristotle invite reflection on a determinate comprehensive good, first of the city and then of the soul, Pierre Manent counsels deference to the practical structure of the good, the structure of the good as it operates in practice, and shows little interest in some final philosophical or theological determination of a higher good. Now, a word on Manent's the Christian dimension of his Aristotelianism. The second part of his solution, in other words. Manent has made the case for the vital importance of the national political form of the nation state, most notably in A World Without Nations. But it is in his more recent Beyond Radical Secularism, this is the source of the reading provided to some of you, Repurposing Europe. It is here that Manent more fully explains his attachment to the nation and especially the continuing Christian meaning of this national political form. To grasp the current potential of the nation state requires understanding the nation state as originating in a political community of Christian confession in the 16th and 17th centuries especially, the confessional European states that arose as a response, Manent admits, a response to the debilitating division and confusion of religious and political authority that characterized the Christian Middle Ages. Europeans, Manent explained, and this is quotation number 9, Europeans progressively abandoned the idea of a Christian empire for the form of the nation state in the ardent pursuit of new and ever more intimate alliances between the government of man and divine benevolence. I'm skipping a few lines. It was necessary to find place for the collaboration of human prudence, human practical wisdom, and divine providence. In this collaboration, very telling remark now, the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, the most official theologian of traditional Catholicism, the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas was able to provide the principles, but not to show the way to put them concretely into practice. So for Manent, St. Thomas's understanding of natural law provides principles for a human-divine partnership, but it does not fully explain them or work out the political implications. So Manent is proposing quite radically a more deeply political version of Thomism, of St. Thomas Aquinas' philosophy. He wants to show how the truth of Thomism is a deeply political truth. Then we come to quotation number 10, where I address a decisive moment in Manent's proposition of a new political Thomism. We have lost faith, Manent argues, in the idea of self-government that animated European nations since they began to take form in the High Middle Ages. Simultaneously, we have lost faith in providence, lost faith in self-government, and lost faith in providence, in the benevolence and protection of the Most High. These two losses of faith go together. That's his point. The two, I'm skipping now in your text, the two operations of freedom are inseparable as are action and hope. Every action, and especially every civic or political action, is carried out in view of some good, especially in view of the common good. The common good, which depends upon us, is nevertheless bigger than us, too big for us. We can't fully command or take full responsibility for the good that we necessarily seek as citizens and statesmen. Doing what depends upon us as best we can decline to appropriate this good that is greater than us, softening our pride a little, suspending internally our action in order to confide the common good to the agent, the divine agent who is greater than any action and than any human good. As vacillating and prone to fail as we are, it makes sense to put our common good, so mysteriously substantial and durable, under the protection and the direction of providence. We address the Most High from the site, situated as we are in our action, and for the common good of the city of which we are citizens. Our political concerns necessarily extends to a faith in some power beyond us. And in this way, Manent clearly goes beyond Aristotle. Faith, therefore, as an act of partnership with a universal personal God, achieves an eminent expression in the great politics of the providential nation-state, a nation-state that believes it has some purpose with respect to the accomplishment of divine goods, a task that compels the Christian statesman to attend to the partial truths asserted by the major claimants in today's contest for the soul of civilization, including Islam, secular liberalism, American Protestant liberalism, as Manent characterizes it, and so forth. So as with the case of virtue and statesmanship, the political role of Christianity makes us aware of a second-order good achieved by Christian statesmanship. Beyond, this is quite bold, but beyond the immediate, theologically defined good of Christianity, there is a Christian good to be achieved by Christian statesmanship in reconciling other goods. Okay, I want to be sure to leave time for questions and discussions, so I am going to skip over most of my discussion of Christian complications, which is kind of a favorite of mine, but no doubt some of us will get a chance to discuss it later. Let me just conclude with the following statement. To let the divine truth come towards us, a beautiful phrasing of Manent's. Say we can press so far, we must take our individual action for which we are responsible up to a certain point, but we can't achieve everything we hope for. We don't even know exactly what to hope for, but must defer to our hope in a higher agent. To let the divine truth come towards us means to let it keep coming towards us in our practice of moral and political agency, not to posit some definite theological end, not to try to capture a higher purpose in theory or theology. This is the deep truth of the fundamental insight of Thomas Aquinas that Manent continues to honor. Aquinas' motto, it has been said, was this: grace does not destroy nature, it perfects her. Grace perfects nature. But the modern tyranny of theory, of system, in the end a result of the medieval ascendancy of theology, Manent concedes. This modern tyranny of theory, ending up in the strategy of separations we discussed, the modern tyranny of theory requires Manent to insist that the nature to be perfected, in Thomas Aquinas' reference, is inescapably a practical, moral, and political nature. This is the point upon which Manent insists again and again. The nature of being perfected, we must not lose sight of what we know about what it is to be perfected. The good we know from our practical choices and from our, especially from our political judgment and deliberation. The divine truth can only come towards us as we assume practical responsibility for the common goods of the real communities, not some abstract or fanciful universal humanity, but the real communities of which we are a part. Neither one of these three things, neither modern rational mastery for the sake of humanity, nor two, the humble Protestant abnegation of responsibility for human goods, nor three, classical or medieval speculation on a highest good beyond practice, none of these three can relieve us of our responsibility as rational, moral, and political beings for the only goods available to us by nature, and thus the only goods of which we can coherently speak. That is, the goods inherent in our moral and political agency, goods that are inseparable from the very practice of that moral agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hancock. We have 15 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes to take some questions, after which there will be a reception outside, so you can continue to talk to each other about the lecture and approach Dr. Hancock and talk to him about it too. So let me ask you to...
Let me, can I lean here? I've already complained. I have one of these backs that when I'm standing it wants to sit, and then when I'm sitting it wants to stand. But I'm gonna lean here a minute. Yeah.
And let's start with...
Did I throw off the cameraman, or maybe it didn't? Okay.
Let's start with the student question, and then proceed to others. So,
if I may say, I would very much appreciate, I put it this way to my students as a joke, I would very much appreciate dumb questions. That is to say, questions that, along the lines, I'm not sure what you meant, or what was the point here, a question to help you get your footing. There are plenty of like exploratory open-ended questions which would be fun too, but especially useful would be the help questions. Okay, where does Manent find the hope for practical solutions to problems that don't have any systematic, explicit theoretical answer? Well, a short answer, and I repeat myself, but to get started, is in the nature, the structure of practice itself. That is to say, we experience the goodness and nobility of human practice. We solve problems, and in doing so, we not only bring about like measurable physical goods, from technology to peace, let's say, but in doing so, we understand human nature, we understand ourselves, we thrive, we are more fully what we're meant to be. So a premise behind this is Aristotle's premise that human beings are by nature political beings. Now, Manent does not carry that to the same degree that Aristotle does. That's the dose of Christian humility that I pointed up. But there's a huge truth in that. Look, no need to make this too abstract. You're parts of various kinds of communities, like families. Anyone here from a big family? I have 5 children. That's kind of modest in Provo, Utah. I have a son. Dare I say? I have a son. Wasn't Julie's or my plan, but my son Jared and his wife Lucinda have 9 children. Now there's a community for you. So I'm a father. I'm a dad. Solving problems. What happens when you solve a practical problem? If you're lucky, you actually solve the problem for a while. Your kids are quarreling over this or that. Your daughter is having trouble with her homework. There's one that touches me a bit. I'm very tired. I grade homework all day long. I help my daughter anyway. There's courage or fortitude there, you know. Then in helping her, I learn about her. And we learn about the subject matter a little bit, and I learn how to talk with her. I learn how to solve problems with my daughter. Now, that's familial. Aristotle wouldn't respect that. It doesn't rise to the level of political deliberation, but anything we do in a community like that. I mean, you're part of a condominium association. What are they called? Homeowners association. And, you know, there's a disagreement about do we spend money to repave or one thing or another. Well, that's pretty banal. That's not very interesting. But I submit to you that somebody who's good at solving that problem, bringing people together, getting the job done, that's a good person. There are real virtues that come to the fore in doing that. And these are intrinsically admirable and satisfying. It's good to be that person. It's a lot of work. It's good to be that person that solves that homeowners association problem. Tocqueville talks about this, these wonderful examples. Tocqueville says that, in France, where we're used to the centralizing state being responsible for everything, you could talk about hurricanes, etc., but that's tough. Let's not. In France, Tocqueville says, if there's a problem with the road, it's like, why isn't the administrator, the magistrate, why isn't somebody doing something about this? In America, what happens? We may wax nostalgic about this, but a few neighbors noticed there's potholes in the road. There wasn't asphalt, I guess, but anyway, the example works. They go out. What do? What happens? You going to help me tell the Tocquevillian story? Okay, you could have got a point for answering that question. I bet that. They go out and they talk together. They get the job done. By the way, a little germ of legitimate aristocracy pops up to make this happen, because it's not some pie in the sky idea of equality, everybody's voice being equal. What on earth would that even mean? Somebody takes the initiative, convinces other people. Yeah, people are generally involved and they get it done. The road is repaved or the holes filled or whatever. And you know what else happened? People just got better and they enjoyed it. You see what I mean? I think that's part of what Manent is talking about. You want to choose among this
Well, let's
lady?
have a couple more students.
Oh,
You have something on the road?
I'll follow up. Yeah.
As far as getting something done, like a pothole that exists by the TR library on Central Street. I guessed about it because it's still there.
Yeah.
Months, years. Okay.
They need to submit a request.
They can't determine if it's in the city or the county.
There you go.
Nothing happens.
Well, I think it's Trump's fault, but that's just my opinion.
Let's have this young man who's in the middle here.
Why isn't Manent more concerned about the beginnings of Christianity if there is a national appropriation of the Christian God? The reason why I'm asking this is because he says, as citizens, our part is not perfectly to imitate divine partiality, but shouldn't we try to get at least as close to an ideal as we can?
No. No, I mean, it's an excellent question. That's why Manent knows you can see lines in which he sees the objection coming and he tries to answer it. But shockingly, I would tend to say you accuse Manent of the paganization of Christianity, and Manent will say, in due measure, bingo, that's what's needed. Yeah, I mean, it's a very Aristotelian reading of, a very Aristotelian revision of Christianity. It's a very Christian revision of Aristotle too. But he says, was it in the lines you just quoted? So he says directly,
But as citizens, our party's not perfectly to imitate the Bible.
that's pretty strong. Yeah, God. This could remind us of the Catholic principle that's more a 19th, 20th century discussion, isn't it, of subsidiarity. How many know what I mean when I reference subsidiarity? Which means that to do good, you start with what's close to you, your family, your community, and really think about it. It's human existence is inconceivable without something like subsidiarity. I mean, anyone who weighed his own child's good just equally with the good of some random stranger somewhere, because, I mean, rationally, we're all equal, or we're equally sons and daughters of God, so how could you give preference? Because you're a human being, and God wants you to be a human being, and human beings are partly pagan, is the short answer. Yeah, so now he addresses, he says, of course this can go too far. God with us can be a sinister slogan, but it doesn't need to be. And actually the worst excesses of nationalism, the real paganization, came, we're thinking of fascists and Nazis, the real paganization came with a neo-paganism, not when the European nation state renounced its Christian inheritance.
Yes, Mr. Mix?
So just listening to your presentation, I kept thinking of Rousseau, and I wondered how much Manent drew his thoughts from Rousseau, most particularly when he talked about how modern society, in pushing for more rights, has caused the loss of people's own agency over deciding what's
Yeah.
good or not. I just kept hearing Rousseau, and I wondered if he draws on people.
Manent knows Rousseau like the back of his hand, and he already, in that book I discovered in the Harvard Library, Births of Modern Politics, that's a Machiavelli, Hobbes, Rousseau book, and he's written on Rousseau many times since. So he certainly learned what can be learned from Rousseau. His position is not, his objection to liberal individualism resonates to Rousseau up to a certain point. But here would be the key difference. I mean, Rousseau is still a modern, as is obvious in his embrace of a state of nature doctrine, actually a state of nature more radical than Hobbes or Locke's state of nature, as you know. What does freedom mean for Rousseau? The brute independence of the natural savage on the one hand, and then the self-legislating law of the civilized person on the other hand, which is, of course, the anticipation of Kant's moral philosophy, the philosophy of autonomy. This is a sophisticated compare and contrast answer, so I'm just giving you a few indications. I'll just say in this most recent work on natural law and human rights, Manent completely wipes the floor, in my view, with the idea of autonomy. It's incoherent because we don't command ourselves, and that leaves our moral universe without content except formal legislation. So autonomy, Rousseau's freedom is in many ways the opposite from Manent's putting in common of action and under the cardinal virtues that are universally emergent qualities of good action.
You mentioned how Manent rejected the tyranny of theory and rationalism and systems and so forth.
Yeah.
But it seems like Manent himself is operating within some kind of transcendent framework. So how would he ground or justify that transcendent morality that he's trying to take forward?
I'm sometimes tempted by the word transcendent, but interestingly, Manent isn't. So you would have to tell me, where does he reach for a theory of transcendence or something?
Maybe
The risk is always there, and you're certainly right in this, that there's always the task of reading off the character of practice without imposing a theory from the outside is an infinitely subtle task. European phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, are all about trying to do that. I think Manent does it better, less technically, and more faithful to actual human experience. But you have an objection, and have I addressed it? Or so what theory do you see him imposing upon practice?
Well, it just seems like he's trying to advance the idea of universally applicable morality in terms of which we should
Oh.
or ought to operate.
Okay, true.
Can I-
Yeah.
I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but this is a question I had, and you can tell me if this
Yeah.
adds to it. You just, and particularly in your answer to Ms. Lewis, gave a lovely description of the satisfactions of being like a statesman-like figure, even in a smaller level, a father or mother,
Yeah.
or someone that takes charge of a community problem. And that made me just wonder for a minute, is Manent setting up the statesman as kind of the highest human type if he discredits I see the triangle that you set up at the
Yeah.
beginning, but I just wonder why he wouldn't say that the statesman who actually imagines the unity of all these goods is the highest human type. And therefore, the political would take on a kind of
Yeah.
transcendent.
It'd be more than the
Is that-
than the quasi-foundational point, but it's a Christian statesman, and in a way, the Aristotelian statesman is implicitly refuted or ever so slightly demoted, because this would get us to the heart of many things, the complications of Christianity that I failed in my promise to discuss. But Christianity, Manent is finally claiming that Christianity, in a very general way, is truer to our very political natures than pagan political philosophy was, than Plato and Aristotle. Because whereas Plato and Aristotle tried to encompass, you could say totalize, human hope, human aspiration, human meaning under the lodestar of some idea of pure philosophical contemplation, Manent says, actually, we can't know that, and even if we could, it wouldn't satisfy us, it wouldn't make us happy. What makes us happy is not within human control. We can't even name it. He says once that the élan, the movement towards nobility, towards something higher, is stronger than any idea we might have of it. So there's an open-endedness to Manent's thought that isn't in Aristotle, and this accounts for the partially progressive historicist dimension, which he understands to be only coherent under the possibility of a creator God who actually cares about humanity, a providential God. Now, what was the question we started from? Because I haven't quite got back to it.
Question of transcendence, and I just offered maybe the Bible is the transcendent.
Yes, so there's a careful balancing act in Manent between the transcendence that arises from politics and the open horizon that depends upon a figure, something like the biblical God. Okay.
Well, we are out of time for the moment, but please feel free to stay around and ask Dr. Hancock your questions. Let's all thank him for.
Thank you very much.